Okay? We're supposed to start, Mike, or? I may begin. Thank you. Well, Mike gave me some orders yesterday. He told me that instead of just throwing the thing open to discussion the way I've done in past years, he wanted me to make a little speech first. I don't know why. I have to ask him. But if the speech is too boring, stop me and we can go off the other way. The speech is supposed to be about the fact that this is a media institute, and therefore you're concerned primarily with the media. So I'm supposed to talk about the media, which actually I write about and so on. But that's a little bit misleading. Part of the reason, at least for me, why I write about the media is because I'm really interested in the whole general kind of intellectual culture. And the part of it that's easiest to study is the media. So, you know, it comes out every day. You got a ton of things. You can do systematic investigation. You can compare yesterday's version with today's version. You have a lot of evidence about what's played up and what isn't played up and the way things are structured and so on. My frank impression is that the media aren't very different from scholarship or from, say, journals of intellectual opinion and stuff like that. But more, there are some extra constraints, but it's not radically different. They interact and they're not that far apart, which is why people go up and back quite easily among them. When you talk about, so I'll talk about the media, but that's mainly for these reasons. You look at the media, you take a look at any institution, you want to understand it. You first of all ask questions about its internal institutional structure, like how are they structured and organized. You want to know something about their setting in the broader society. So what's their institutional setting? How do they relate to other systems of power and authority and so on? And if you're lucky, there's an internal record which tells you from leading people in the information system, which tells you what they're up to. And you want to pay attention to that. So sort of a doctrinal system. That doesn't mean the PR handouts, but what they say, you know, to each other, let's say, about what they're up to. And there's quite a lot of that, and that's interesting. So those are three major sources of information about the nature of the media. You want to study them the way, you know, say a scientist would study some complex molecule or something. You take a look at the structure, and then you make some hypotheses based on the structure as to what the media product is likely to look like, and then you investigate, see what the media product is and how well it conforms to these hypotheses and if it diverges where and so on and so forth. And virtually all the work in media analysis is this last part, trying to study carefully just what the media product is and whether indeed it conforms to the obvious assumptions about the nature and the structure of the media. And there are various ways to approach that question. They've been discussed, and we could talk about that. So that's the field of media analysis. Well, what do you find, roughly? I mean, like 1 minute sketch. Of course, it's pretty obvious, so I don't have to waste any time on it. First of all, if you look at the media, you find that they're differentiated. So there's different media which do different things, like the entertainment industry, you know, the Hollywood and soap operas and so on, or even most of the newspapers in the country, like the overwhelming majority of them. They are aimed at a mass audience. There's another sector of the media, the kind of elite media, sometimes called the agenda-setting media, because they're the ones with the big resources, and they set the framework within which everybody else operates and so on. So that's like the New York Times, you know, and CBS and that kind of thing. They have a different audience. Their audience is mostly quite privileged people. So the people who read the New York Times, let's say, a small sector of the population, people are wealthy, part of sometimes what's called the political class. You know, they're actually involved in the political system in an ongoing fashion. They're basically managers of one sort or another. They can be political managers, business managers like corporate executives, or that sort of thing, or doctoral managers like university professors, or other journalists and so on, who are involved in kind of organizing the way people think and look at things. So that's basically the audience of the elite media. The elite media do set a framework within which others operate. So like if you're watching the Associated Press, you know, it grinds out the news in a constant flow. If you're watching it at around, you know, mid-afternoon, it breaks. And there's something comes along every day which says, notice to editors. Tomorrow's New York Times is going to have the following stories on the front page. Okay, and the point of that is that if you're like an editor of a newspaper in Dayton, Ohio or something, and you don't have the resources to figure out what the news is and you don't want to think about it anyway, this tells you what the news is. Okay, so these are the stories. Like for the quarter page that you're going to devote to something other than diverting your audience, these are the stories that you put there, because that's what the New York Times tells us is what you're supposed to think for tomorrow, you know. And it's not, you know, if you were an editor in Dayton, Ohio, you would sort of have to do that because you don't have much else in the way of resources. And if you get out of line, like if you're producing stories that the big press doesn't like, you'll hear about it pretty soon. In fact, what just happened at San Jose Mercury News is a dramatic example of this. So there are a lot of ways in which power plays can drive you right back into line if you move out. And if you try to break the mold, you're not going to last long. So that framework does, in fact, work pretty well. And it's understandable. I mean, it's just a reflection of obvious power structures. Well, for the mass media, you know, the real mass media, those that are directed to a mass audience, I mean, you know perfectly well what they're up to. They're basically trying to divert people, to get them out of our hair. You know, let them do something else, but don't bother us being the people who run the show. So let them get interested. Professional sports is an example. Let them everybody be crazed about professional sports or sex scandals or, personalities and their problems or something like that. Anything as long as it's not serious. Because the serious stuff is for the big guys. We take care of that. So that's the real mass media. Actually, they're not much studied, which is a shame, because it's an interesting, it's a hard topic to study all that kind of stuff. You know, a lot of things you got to look at, but it takes resources. But especially if you're thinking about television and the movies and so on. But anyway, what they're up to is pretty obvious, and anybody knows it who lives in this society, because you're exposed to it all the time. So let me talk just about the elite media, the agenda-setting ones. What are they? So like the New York Times and CBS, for example. Well, first of all, they are major corporations, very profitable, huge corporations. Furthermore, most of them are either interlinked or outright owned by much bigger corporations like General Electric and Westinghouse and so on. So they're way up at the top of the power structure of the private economy. Which is a very tyrannical structure. I mean, corporations are basically tyrannies, you know, hierarchic, control from above. I mean, you don't like what they're doing, you get out, and that sort of thing. And the major media are just part of that system. What about their institutional setting? Well, that's more or less the same. I mean, what they interact with and relate to is other major power centers. So the government, other corporations, the universities, because they are a doctrinal system, so they interact closely with the universities. Like if you're a reporter and you're writing a story on, Central, I don't know, Southeast Asia or Africa or something like that, you're supposed to go over to the big university and find an expert, and they'll tell you what to write, or else go to one of the foundations, like Brookings Institute or American Enterprise Institute, and they'll give you the words to say and so on. These outside institutions are very similar to the media. I mean, the universities, for example, are not independent institutions. I mean, like there may be independent people scattered around in them, but that's true of the media, it's true of the corporations, it's true of fascist states for that matter. But the institution itself is parasitic. It's dependent on outside sources of support. And those sources of support are not, like Z Magazine or 95% of the population in the country. They're private wealth, big corporations with grants, the government, which is itself so closely interlinked with corporate power that you can barely distinguish them. That's essentially what the university is in the middle of. And people within them who don't sort of adjust to that structure and accept it, and usually internalize it, because you can't really work with it unless you internalize it and believe it. People who don't do that are likely to be weeded out along the way, actually starting from kindergarten, all the way up. There's all sorts of filtering devices that get rid of people who are a pain in the neck and think independently and so on and so forth, and you end up with there's a lot of, you've all been through college, and you know that the whole educational system is very highly geared to rewarding conformity and obedience. I mean, if you don't do that, you're a troublemaker and so on. So it's kind of filtering device, which ends up with people who really honestly, they're not lying, they honestly internalize the framework of belief and attitudes of the surrounding of the power system in the society. The real elite institutions, like say, Harvard and Princeton and the upscale small colleges, for example, I mean, they're very much geared to socialization. I don't know if you happen to have been in them, but if you go through, say, a place like Harvard, most of what goes on there is teaching you manners. So like how to behave like a member of the upper classes and how to think the right thoughts and so on and so forth. Actually, that was pointed out by George Orwell in an essay that had an interesting history. Everybody knows Animal Farm, okay, came out around mid-40s. And it was a satire on the Soviet Union, totalitarian state. So big hit, everybody loved it. Turns out that he wrote an introduction to Animal Farm, which was suppressed. Came out, only appeared 30 years later. Somebody found it in his papers. The introduction to Animal Farm, he was writing in England. The introduction to Animal Farm was called Literary Censorship in England. And what it says is that obviously this book is, carries, it's ridiculing the Soviet Union and its totalitarian structure. But he said England's not all that different. I mean, we're a free society, we don't have the KGB on our neck, but the end result comes out pretty much the same. He says people who have independent ideas or who think the wrong kind of thoughts are cut out of the, they're removed from reaching the public in one or another fashion. And then he gives some examples and so on. Then he talks a little bit, he has only a few sentences of analysis as to why it happens. I mean, what I'm talking about now, the institutional structure, actually has 2 sentences. He says, why does this happen? He says, well, one, because the press is owned by wealthy men who only want certain things to reach the public, which is, a very brief way of saying what I was saying in a complicated way. And the other thing he said is that when you go through the elite education system, like you go through the proper schools and you end up in Oxford and so on, the path to entering into the top of the society, you go through this, you just learn that there are certain things that it's not proper to say, and in fact there are certain thoughts that it's not proper to have. Well, that's the socialization role of the elite institutions, and if you don't adapt to that, you're usually out. There's statistical error in the system, so you get sort of people filtering through for one or another reason. But he's basically correct. I mean, those 2 sentences more or less tell the story. The press is owned by wealthy men, meaning, big corporations and tied to other powers and so on, and they have a certain picture of the world they want to see expressed, and it is expressed. And the other thing is that the people who enter it, who make it through the system and are in positions where they can do anything about it, they have internalized the proper beliefs and attitudes, or else they wouldn't be there. It's like when you do criticism of the media, and you say, look, here's what Anthony Lewis or somebody else is writing, they get very angry. And they say quite correctly that nobody ever tells me what to write. I write anything I like. All this business about pressures and constraints is nonsense because I'm never under any pressure, which is completely true. But the point is they wouldn't be in that position unless they had already demonstrated that nobody has to tell them what to write because they're going to say the right thing. And if they hadn't, if they had started off at, at the Metro desk or something and had pursued the wrong kind of stories, they never would have made it to the positions where they can now say anything they like. So nobody's telling them what to say, and the same is true of the university faculty and so on, but it's because they've been through the socialization system. Okay, well, you look at that structure, that whole system, what do you expect the news product to be like? Well, pretty obvious, actually. I mean, here's the New York Times. It's a corporation, sells a product. The product is audiences. They don't make money when you buy the newspaper. They're happy to put it on the World Wide Web for free. They actually lose money when you buy the newspaper. But the audience is the product. The product is privileged people, just like the guys who are writing the newspapers, top-level decision-making people in the society. And you have to sell a product to a market, and the market is, of course, advertisers, that is, other businesses. So whether it's television or newspapers or whatever, they're selling audiences. It's corporations selling audiences to other corporations. And in the case of the elite media, it's big businesses. So like, not the corner grocery store, but big guys. Well, what do you expect to happen? You're a scientist from Mars looking at this institutional structure. What would your prediction be about the nature of the media product given that whole set of circumstances? It would obviously be kind of null hypothesis, the assumption that you'd make, assuming nothing further, the obvious assumption has to be refuted, is that the product of the media, what appears, what doesn't appear, the way it's slanted, the whole story, will reflect the interests of the buyers and the sellers and the product, and the institutional and the power systems that are around them. I mean, if that wouldn't happen, it'd be kind of a miracle. So perfectly obvious assumption is that that's what happens. Okay, then comes the hard work. You look at you see how they cover this and how they cover that and why they don't do this and why they don't do that, and you ask, does it work the way you'd predict? And the answer is, well, you can judge for yourselves. There's lots of material on this, and this obvious hypothesis has been subjected to the hardest tests anybody can think of, and it stands up remarkably well. You virtually never find anything in the social sciences that's as strongly supported as this conclusion, which is not a big surprise, because if it didn't, it would be miraculous if it didn't hold up, given the way that the forces are operating. Next thing you discover is that this whole topic is completely taboo. It cannot be discussed. I mean, if there's an academic media conference run by, lefty pacifists or something, you can be certain that this topic will not arise. If you go to the Kennedy School and the Media Institute or, Stanford or somewhere, and you study journalism or communications or, academic political science and so on, these questions will never appear. That is the null hypothesis, the hypothesis that any idiot would come across without even knowing anything. That is not allowed to be expressed, and the evidence bearing on it cannot be discussed. Well, you'd predict that too. If you look at the institutional structure, you would say, yeah, sure, that's got to happen, because why should these guys want to be exposed? Why should they allow critical analysis of what they're up to take place? And the answer is that no reason why they should allow that. The fact is they don't. And again, it's not purposeful censorship. It's just that you don't make it to those positions, even if you're on the left. It includes the left, as what's called the left, as well as the right, unless you have been adequately socialized and trained so that there's, Orwell put it, there are just some thoughts you don't have, and if you did have them, you wouldn't be in there. That works as well, so you get kind of like a second-order prediction that comes out, and is well confirmed, is that the first-order predictions are highly verified but never discussed, not allowed into discussion. Makes perfect sense, fits the nature of the institution. Last thing to look at is the kind of the doctrinal framework in which this proceeds. Like, is there thinking about it? Do people at high levels in the information system, including the media and advertising and academic academic political science and so on, do these people have a picture of what ought to happen when they're writing for each other, not when they're making graduation speeches? You make a commencement speech, pretty words and stuff, but when you're writing academic articles or, serious thought or something like that, what do people say about it? Well, actually, there's a good record of that, and it's interesting and consistent, and it goes exactly along with this picture. And it's quite interesting to look at. So there's basically three currents that you want to look at. One is the public relations industry, the main business propaganda industry. So what do those guys say? What do the leaders of the PR industry say? Second place to look is what are called the public intellectuals, the big thinkers who are supposed to, the guys who write the op-eds and that sort of thing. So what do they say? The people who write, impressive books about the nature of democracy and that sort of business. you look at that. Third thing you look at is the academic stream. And here it's essentially the main place to look is that part of political science which is concerned with communications and information and you know, that stuff, which is a branch of political science in the last 70 or 80 years. So take a look at those three things and see what they say. And just look at the leading figures who have all written about this, and they all say the same thing. And it's kind of interesting. What they say is, the basic picture is, look, the general population are, these are just quotes, are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who have no, we have to keep them out of the public arena because they are too stupid, and if they get involved, they'll just make trouble. Their job is to be spectators, not participants. They're allowed to vote every once in a while, pick out one of us smart guys, but then they're supposed to go home and do something else, like, you know, watch the football game or whatever it may be. But the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders have to be observers, not participants. The participants are what are called the responsible men. And of course the writer is always one of them. You never ask the question why I'm a responsible man and somebody else is in jail, let's say, but the answer is pretty obvious. It's because you are obedient and subordinated to power, and that other guy may be independent and so on. But that you don't ask, of course. So there's the smart guys, and we're supposed to run the show, and the rest of them are supposed to be out. And we should not succumb to, I'm quoting from an academic article, to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. They're terrible judges of their own interests, so we got to do it for them for their own benefit. And it's actually it's very similar to Leninism. It translates almost exactly into the Leninist line. You know, the party dictatorship, we do things for you, and you're too dumb to do it yourself, and we're doing it in the interest of everyone, and so on. And I suspect that that's part of the reason why it's been so easy historically for people to shift up and back from being a, you know, sort of enthusiastic Stalinist to being a big supporter of U.S. power. I mean, people go up and back without any difficulty. I mean, say the David Horowitz type, to take a current example, it's very easy. You switch very quickly from one position to the other. And I think my suspicion is the reason is because it's basically the same position. You know, you're not making much of a switch. You're just making a different estimate of where power lies. You know, at one point you think it's here, another point you think it's here, take the same position. Well, that's the basic doctrine. How did it evolve? That also has an interesting history. A lot of it comes out of the First World War, which was a big turning point. First of all, it changed the position of the United States in the world scene considerably. I mean, around the turn of the century, the U.S. was, in fact, in the 18th century, the United States was already the richest place in the world. I mean, the quality of life, say, you know, health, longevity, you know, all that kind of stuff, of colonists in 18th century America, that was not achieved by the upper classes in Britain until the early 20th century. I mean, let alone anybody else in the world. I mean, this country is extraordinarily wealthy and, you know, huge advantages. And by the end of the 19th century, it had by far the biggest economy in the world. But it was not a big player in the world scene. I mean, U.S. power sort of extended to the Caribbean islands, not, you know, parts of the Pacific, not much farther. During the First World War, the relations did change. I mean, they changed dramatically during the Second World War. The Second World War, the U.S. just took over the world. But the First World War, there was already a change. And in fact, the U.S. shifted from being a debtor to a creditor nation in the First World War, and it became a, not huge, it wasn't like Britain, but it became a substantial actor in the world, you know, for the first time. That was one change. But there were other changes. During the First World War was the first time when there was really coordinated state propaganda. Highly organized, coordinated state propaganda. It was first the British. The British had a Ministry of Information, and they really needed it because they had to get the United States into the war, or else they were going to get in bad trouble. So they had a Ministry of Information which was mainly geared to sending propaganda, including huge fabrications about Hun atrocities and so on, and they were targeting American intellectuals on the reasonable assumption that these are the people who are most gullible and most likely to believe propaganda, and they'll accept what we say, which was true. And they're also the ones who can then disseminate it and, you know, run their own system. So it was mostly geared to American intellectuals, and it worked very well. The British Ministry of Information documents have, you know, a lot of them been released, and their goal was, as they put it, to control the thought of the entire world. Kind of minor goal, but mainly the United States. They didn't care much what people thought in India, you know, but it makes a lot of difference what they think in the United States. So they had this big Ministry of Information. It was extremely successful in deluding top hotshot American intellectuals into accepting British propaganda fabrications. They were very proud of that. Properly so. It sort of saved their lives. They would have lost the First World War otherwise. In the United States, there was a counterpart. Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1916 on the platform. This is a very pacifist country. It has always, you know, people don't want to go fight foreign wars. And the country was very much opposed to the First World War, and Wilson was in fact elected on an anti-war position. Peace without victory was the slogan. But he was intending to go to war. So the question is, how do you get the pacifist population to become, you know, raving anti-German lunatics, so they want to go out and kill all the Germans and so on. You have to do that, and that requires propaganda. So they set up the first, and in fact, really only major state propaganda agency in U.S. history, Committee on Public Information, it was called, you know, nice Orwellian title. And it's usually called the Creel Commission. The guy who ran it was named Creel. And the task of this commission was to propagandize the population into becoming, into drive the population to kind of like a, you know, jingoist hysteria and wartime frenzy. And it really worked. I mean, it worked incredibly. I mean, what happened in the country is unbelievable. But within a few months, it worked. And there was a raving war hysteria, and the U.S. was able to go to war. The people who were involved in that, a lot of people were impressed by these achievements, a lot. One person who was impressed, and this has some implications for the future, was Hitler. If you read Mein Kampf, he describes this, and he concludes, with some justification, that Germany lost the First World War because it lost the propaganda battle. They could not begin to compete with British and American propaganda, which absolutely overwhelmed them. And, you know, he pledges that next time around they'll have their own propaganda system, and which they did, and so it was more even competition during the Second World War. More important for us, highly impressed, was the American business community. They had a problem at that time. The country was becoming formally more democratic. You know, like a lot more people were able to vote and that sort of thing, and it was becoming wealthier. You know, more people could participate, and a lot of new immigrants coming in and so on. So what do you do? It's going to be harder to run the thing as like a private club. Therefore, obviously, you have to control what people think. There had been public relations specialists, but there was never a public relations industry. You know, so there was a guy hired to make Rockefeller's image look prettier and that sort of thing. But this huge public relations industry, which is a U.S. invention and a monstrous industry, it came out of the First World War, really. And the leading figures in it were people in the Creel Commission. In fact, the main one, Edward Bernays, he comes right out of the Creel Commission. He has a book that came out right afterwards called Propaganda. The term propaganda, incidentally, didn't have negative connotations in those days. It was during the Second World War that the term became taboo because it was, you know, connected to Germany and all those bad things. But in this period, and in fact in most of the world, propaganda, the equivalent term to propaganda just means like information or something. So he wrote a book called Propaganda in around 1925, and it starts off by saying he's applying the lessons of the First World War, the propaganda systems of the First World War, and this commission that he was part of showed, he says, that it is possible, I'm quoting it actually, to regiment the minds of men as well as armies can regiment their bodies. And these new techniques of regimentation of minds, he says, have to be used by the intelligent minorities, that's us, in order to make sure that the Slavs stay on the right course, you know. And now we can do it because we have these new techniques. And then he goes on to, this is in fact the main manual of the public relations industry. He's kind of the guru. He remained so for a long time. An interesting career, which I could describe. He's a big hero among Cambridge liberals, I should say. He was an authentic Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, and very much honored in places like Brattle Square and places like that. Very interesting history, but I'll come back to it. He's honored because he did things like saving the sycamores. There was an attempt to cut down the sycamore trees on Memorial Drive, which is where, nice Cambridge people like to take a walk, and he carried out a public relations campaign which saved the sycamores. Got a lot of points. He also engineered the public relations effort behind the U.S. The coup which overthrew the democratic government of Guatemala. He was behind all that. Another big success. Ended up with hundreds of thousands of corpses and the place ruined, and democracy dead forever. But his major coup, the one that really propelled him into fame, was in the late 20s. And that was getting women to smoke. Women didn't smoke in those days, and he ran a huge campaign for Chesterfield, which, all the techniques, models with cigarettes coming out of their mouths and that kind of thing. And it had a big effect. They got a lot of women to smoke, a huge number of corpses, and he got enormous plaudits for that. So he's, but he remained like the leading figure of the industry, and this book was the real manual. Another member of the Creel Commission was Walter Lippmann, who was he's really the dean of American, the leading figure in American journalism, the most respected figure in American journalism for about half a century. Serious American journalism, the guy who wrote serious think pieces, and that sort of thing. He also wrote what are called progressive essays on democracy, regarded as progressive back in the 20s. And he was again applying the lessons of the wartime propaganda very explicitly. He says, we have the new technique. He said there's a new art in democracy called manufacture of consent. That's his phrase. Ed Herman and I borrowed it for our book, but it comes from Lippmann. He says there's this new art in the method of democracy, manufacture of consent, and that's the sort of core of democracy. That's the way it works. And that's by manufacturing consent, you can overcome the fact that formally a lot of people have the right to vote. We can make it irrelevant, because we can manufacture consent and make sure that the only choices they have, the choices and attitudes will be structured in such a way that they'll always do what we tell them anyway, even if they have a formal way to participate. So we'll have a real democracy that'll work properly. And that's, again, applying the lessons of the propaganda agency. Academic social science comes out of this, political science comes out of the same thing. The sort of founder of the field of what's called communications in academic political science, Harold Lasswell, his main achievement, the thing that sort of propelled him into fame, was a book on propaganda, study of propaganda. And he says very frankly the things that I was quoting before, those things about not succumbing to democratic dogmatisms, that comes from academic political science, Lasswell and these guys. Again, drawing the lessons from the wartime experience. Political parties drew the same lessons, especially the Conservative Party in England. Their early documents are just being released. But they also recognized the achievements of the British Ministry of Information, and they also recognized the same problem as here, that the country was getting more democratized and it wouldn't be a private men's club, maybe, so they had a problem. And the conclusion was, as they put it, that politics has to become what they called political warfare, applying the mechanisms of propaganda that worked so brilliantly during the First World War towards controlling people's thoughts and so on. And there's a whole routine that comes out of that. Well, that's the doctrinal side, and it coincides with the institutional structure, and it gives you it strengthens the predictions about whether the thing ought to work, and in fact it does work. Except these conclusions also are not allowed to be discussed. Even this is all now mainstream literature. It's only for people on the inside. You don't like when you go to college, you don't read the classics about how to control people's minds, obviously. Just like you don't read what James Madison said during the Constitutional Convention about how the main goal of the new system has to be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And the system has to be designed so that it achieves that end, and then he sort of lays down things. This is just the founding of the constitutional system, so nobody studies it. I mean, in fact, you can't even find it in the academic scholarship, the whole thing that went on there, unless you really look hard. But okay, I mean, that's roughly the picture as far as I can see. This is the picture of the way the system is institutionally, the doctrines that lie behind it, the way it comes out. There's another whole part which is directed to the, to the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, and that's mainly diversion of one kind or another. And from that, I think you can sort of predict what you would expect to find, and then I think if you look, well, as I say, you can judge for yourself, but I think you more or less find what you'd expect to find. Yeah?
I think many of us feel that we can go to work in these mainstream institutions, that we can go through colleges and universities, as long as we're aware of the kinds of things that you're talking about.
I completely agree. No, look, I mean, I agree. Why am I teaching at MIT? I mean, MIT is the Pentagon university. Through the 1960s, let's say when Mike was a student, and really had a fantastic effect on the place. I mean, he and a couple other people like Steve Shalom and a few others just totally revolutionized the place, changed it forever. It's never been the same since. But at that time, MIT was, well, I was actually on a committee at the time, which for the first time looked at MIT financing. The committee was set up as a result of the student activism to try to cut things, calm things down by trying to do something, the usual story. We did get access to the funding records for the first time. Never really been looked at. Turned out that half, this is by memory, I may have the numbers sort of wrong, but it was 1969, and it's in print, you can check. My recollection is something like this, that about half the MIT budget came from 2 military laboratories, secret laboratories, developing advanced guidance systems for intercontinental missiles and counterinsurgency for Vietnam and so on. That was half the budget. Of the other half of the budget, about 90% came from the Pentagon. Okay, so this is Pentagon University. It was also the center of anti-war activism in this region. Everything, almost everything came out of MIT, very little out of Harvard, at the faculty level, at the student level, and so on. And that still remains the case for those of you who are in the Boston area. You're in the Boston area and you want to run a political meeting on something, you get a room at MIT. That's it's a residue of the same phenomenon. And you couldn't be more in the heart of the power system than there. But that was the most, in fact, most of the resistance in the United States a lot of it came out of MIT. Resist, is in Boston because it was coming out of MIT. It was mostly MIT faculty and so on. So yeah, that's one example, but there are plenty of others. You can do it. I mean, the systems are pretty porous, I mean, they have a lot of internal contradictions that you can play on. I mean, so take the media. They have an internal contradiction, keeping out to the elite media. They have to indoctrinate. You've got to make sure that the responsible men are going to have the right thoughts. On the other hand, you also have to give them a tolerably realistic picture of the world, because they're making decisions that matter to people with real power. And you don't want them to make stupid decisions. You want them to make decisions that relate to reality, So on the one hand, you have to give them a more or less realistic picture of the world. On the other hand, you have to indoctrinate them with a flood of lies. And that's just contradictory. And it's interesting, and it gives a lot of opportunities. Some of the best investigative reporters in the country, I can't name names because they don't want to expose themselves, but people you would certainly know, and they're famous, they understand this system perfectly. They're much more cynical about it than I am, because they're on the inside and they see it every day. And they wait, for opportunities. And they sort of even understand when the opportunities come. Like there's a scandal every couple of years that you can't keep a lid on, like Watergate or Iran-Contra or something. And any top investigative reporter will tell you, if he's honest, that what you do is you wait until there's a scandal. You store up your stories. If there's a scandal, there's going to be a couple of months in which things are opened up a little bit, and you can sort of sneak stories in, and they do that, and you sort of tune your stories so they'll make it through and things like that. I mean, they recognize, and in fact, if you look at the Some of the best reporting in the country, in fact, I think the best reporting in the country probably comes in the Wall Street Journal. That's very honest. And not just on international affairs, on, say, working conditions in, you know, sort of chicken factories where people are treated like slaves, you know, those things. That's where you get the reporting of the Wall Street Journal. Partly it's because they trust their audience. You know, it's not going to matter too much if these guys know sort of what's happening, and you want to give them a realistic picture. But on the other hand, we can read the Wall Street Journal too, and a good reporter on the Wall Street Journal knows this, and will print things knowing that other people are going to look at it. And same in the universities. I mean, there's lots of openings. Same in law firms, same everywhere. So take, say, the big law firms. I mean, you know, Washington is more or less run by about half a dozen corporate law firms. You know, Sullivan and Cromwell and a couple of others. That's where most of the, like the Secretary of State, and, you know, the top bureaucrats, they usually come from those firms. This sort of makes sense because the people in those firms have a kind of a broad view of the general corporate interest, not a parochial view of General Motors' interest, that sort of thing. So they're all you know, right. I mean, they're the big power brokers and, you know, makers and so on and so forth. On the other hand, those law firms have to keep a public image. You know, they want like they would like to get the bright students from Harvard Law School, some of whom still haven't yet been completely socialized and, you know, think that you ought to do nice things for poor people and stuff like that. So they have to have a nice image. And they, in fact, most of them have public interest activities, some of which are not bad, you know. And that gives opportunities to do things. And besides that, there's just a simple question of professional integrity. I mean, after all, you know, these are human beings. I mean, they're not going to, like I say, mostly they don't lie a lot. You have to believe the things you're saying. But there are people who believe other things, and they want to tell the truth about that, and try to find ways to do it. So I entirely agree with you. There's a lot that you can do inside the institutions. On the other hand, the institutions are set up so that people who try to do those things are unlikely to make it through. They may, you know, and if they do, then there's a lot that they can manage, but by and large they won't make it through. So while, say, Walter Lippmann was writing about how the responsible men have to think this and that, Eugene Debs was in jail. Why was Eugene Debs in jail and Walter Lippmann writing about the responsible men? Well, because Walter Lippmann is obedient and does what he's told and so on and so forth, and Eugene Debs was the major labor leader in the country, and he had a different constituency. You know, he was working for poor people, so he's in jail, you know. That's kind of the way it works. Incidentally, no one who writes about this topic will point that out, although it's kind of obvious, that Debs, the major labor figure and labor leader in U.S. history, was jailed by Woodrow Wilson, you know, the great idealist, who indeed actually refused, even when Wilson's term was over, you know, he sort of granted a Christmas amnesty to all sorts of, you know, more or less political prisoners and lots of others, but not Debs. Debs was the one he would not grant amnesty to, and in his secret records he says, why, this guy's got to stay in jail, you know, because he raised questions about the nobility of our enterprise in the First World War, and he's not allowed to talk, period. So he's not responsible, he's in jail, wrong constituency, and Lippmann's a responsible man who, you know, writes big, you know, respectable essays and so on. I mean, that's the way it usually works. But if you do make it through, yes, there are a lot of things you can do.
Is that the Achilles heel? I mean,
one.
Yeah, it just seems like, I know for myself, and I think for a lot of other people, that the system, you know, it's systemic, and the institutions within the system are so massive, you know, and so powerful, and so all pervading that you can't take them all head on, and it's like, I don't know where. This is probably a stupid question, but where can you make the most difference?
Yeah, a lot of places. A lot of places. Yeah. You can work from inside, you can work from outside. Yeah. I mean, like a totalitarian state will react to ferment at the grassroots. Mm-hmm. It'll have to. I mean, there is no power system, no matter how authoritarian it is, that can ignore what's happening among the general population. You have to respond to that. And ferment at the grassroots, wherever it is, in a college or in a community or in the country, will affect the way decisions are made. Often very dramatically. I mean, so for example, take say the United States in the early, take say the question of intervention, military intervention, aggression, you know, call it by its right name, aggression or international terrorism and so on. That was considered completely unproblematic in the early 60s. I mean, so unproblematic that to this day, no educated person could, and if you ask people, you know, try it, ask some Harvard professor, when did the United States invade South Vietnam? You know, what was the date? They won't even know what you're talking about. I mean, no such event took place. You know, how could it have a date? You know, well, of course, the event took place. You know, it took place late '61, early '62, when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force, you know, like not mercenaries, to bomb the South Vietnamese countryside, and authorized the use of napalm and started crop destruction so that people wouldn't have food to eat and wouldn't support the guerrillas. No North Vietnam, no Russia or China. This is South Vietnam, which was always the main target of the U.S. attack. So yeah, that was a U.S. attack against South Vietnam. I mean, it wasn't a secret. Like you could read in the New York Times that, I mean, true on sort of the back page, but it was there, that 30% of the missions against the South Vietnamese countryside were being flown by U.S. pilots in planes with South Vietnamese markings, so it wouldn't be so obvious that they're U.S. planes. It was right there. I mean, everybody knew about it. Napalm you knew about, crop destruction you knew about. It's just there was nobody thought there was anything wrong with it. You know, like there's 20 people in the country who thought there's something wrong with this. And that went on for years. I mean, it wasn't, you look at the history of the anti-war movement. I mean, it was not in a place like Boston, for example. As late as 1966, 5 years after that, we couldn't have public meetings against the war. Even with mild slogans like, you know, don't bomb North Vietnam or something, which was not the issue. You couldn't have them because they'd be physically broken up, in fact, mostly by students from the big universities, with the applause of the media, like the liberal press would think that's terrific. Why let these guys talk, you know? And that's 5 years after the, you know, a couple 100,000 American troops marauding and so on. That's all gone. You know, now that's totally inconceivable. In fact, when the, every new administration, they have a strategic review, you know, sort of analyze the world situation. Occasionally it leaks. If it doesn't leak, you have to wait 40 years, and if you're lucky, it'll be declassified. But the Bush administration one, parts of it leaked right away. Actually, it came out during the Gulf War. In the middle of the Gulf War, there was a leak from somebody in the Pentagon, obviously, who leaked the strategic analysis. And what it said about intervention was that, quoted, it said, in the case of confrontation with much weaker enemies, meaning any confrontation we're ever going to get into, because we're not going to fight anybody who can shoot back. So in the case of confrontations with much weaker enemies, we must win rapidly and decisively, because anything else will undercut, if it goes on more than a couple days, it's going to undercut political support. Okay? Well, that's a recognition of what I just said, internal recognition, that the days are gone when you can send the American Army and the American Air Force to carry out massive aggression and slaughter in other countries. Can't do it anymore. That's exactly why the Reagan administration had to resort to what they call clandestine activities with mercenaries rather than overt aggression. And those are big changes, and they're changes in policy, you know, major changes in policy, which reflect changes in the society that came out of grassroots activism, you know. And that's just one example. There's tons of them.
I was wondering what comments you might have, or what connections you might draw between the contemporary fervor to join NATO and the European Union trying to gain solidity.
Well, you know, NATO has always been a multidimensional sort of thing. It was presented as if it was a defense against the Russians, but that was a small piece of it. I mean, for one thing, nobody ever expected the Russians to attack. I mean, there's never been an expectation that the Russians would attack unless it was in reaction to the threat of being destroyed. Like if we were, you know, they were, after all, the Russians were always encircled. And there was a recognition that if the noose got too tight, and they feel they're really in danger, they might kind of lash out. But that's the only condition under which anyone ever expected Russian aggression. So NATO was a, it was a military alliance, but a large part of it was to try to keep Europe under control. Now, remember, there's a joint interest in keeping Europe under control on the part of U.S. policymakers and European elites, because Europe, like any other place, is not an entity. There are different people in Europe who have different interests. And after the Second World War, this was particularly significant because, remember, the Second World War was a war, it's hard to remember now, but at the time, the Second World War was a war against fascism. And the people who fought that war were on the left. They were radical Democrats or socialists or communists, labor-based, peasant-based, and so on, all the bad guys. They're the ones who, that's the resistance. The resistance was anti-fascist. And that was it had a lot of prestige at the end of the Second World War, and the old fascist establishment, the traditional establishment had lost its prestige because of its association with Nazism and fascism. Well, that was the situation at the end of the Second World War when all this celebration about the Marshall Plan, you ought to remember that. The situation at the end of the Second World War is that the mass of the population was fairly radical. Kind of radical democratic in some general sense, sometimes called communist, whatever that means, sometimes not. But it was worker and peasant based, and they just wanted a change in the society. They wanted a different world, not a world without the traditional conservative order ruling them. Well, plainly the U.S. was not going to have that, So in fact, the first chapter of post-war history, if there was an honest post-war history around, which there isn't, actually there are a few, like Gabriel Kalko and a couple others, but I mean, like nothing that you read in college. If there was an honest one around, the first chapter of post-war history would be the effort to destroy the European anti-fascist resistance and to restore the fascist order. That's exactly what was done. It started even before the end of the war, as the American troops were coming up through, American and British troops through Italy. That was the, first invasion of the continent was southern Italy. The first thing they did was restore the fascists, literally. So southern Italy was put under the control of Field Marshal Badoglio, who was a great fascist war hero, Ethiopian War, and so on. The king, who was very pro-fascist, was brought back. Actually, the mafia was reconstructed. The fascists run a tight ship. They don't like opposition, so they eliminated the mafia. It was restored as a control measure. As the British and the Americans moved towards northern Italy, they ran into a real problem because northern Italy had been mostly liberated by the resistance, which was no joke in Italy. It was a strong movement. And they had kind of driven out about 6 or 7 German divisions and had liberated most of northern Italy, so that by the time the American British troops got up there, they had to disperse the resistance, not the Nazis. And they did. It was already self-governing, with workers' control and all kind of things going on. That wasn't going to be accepted. So they were thrown out. Actually, the British Labour Party, which was in office then, their representative was particularly appalled because workers, the workers were having a voice in industry. And they were getting rid of bosses, and they had I have a lot of material on this in books I can cite if you like, but they had to get rid of these guys. And the same was true throughout the whole of Europe. You had to get rid of the resistance. Sometimes it was very bloody, like in Greece, about 160,000 people were killed in this effort in the late 40s. And then the other side is you had to restore the traditional order, which meant fascist collaborators, outright Nazis, and so on. Well, it's in that context that NATO was formed. So when you say Europe, it depends which Europe you're talking about. The elite elements wanted NATO as a way of ensuring control of Europe, the same way the Americans wanted NATO as a way of controlling Europe, a certain kind of Europe, not a different kind of Europe. That a large part of NATO was about that. Another part of NATO was, they had a big problem with Germany. Germany was obviously it was in fact considered the natural leader. That's the way it was called in U.S. planning documents, and obviously is. It's the most dynamic, powerful state. Germany practically conquered the world. In terms of technological capacity and so on, the Americans and British were astonished at what the Germans were able to do. And they respected it. You know, they respected the Nazis and they respected their achievement. But the trouble is you can't, you know, they're too much of a threat. So they had to be incorporated within some kind of a European alliance and balanced off against. France was scared to death of them, you know, for pretty obvious reasons, and Britain too. And they had to somehow be incorporated into, well, partly that was achieved by splitting Germany, which is mostly a Western initiative. But it's still, the rich, powerful part of Germany was in the West, and they had to be handled somehow. So NATO was a framework in which Germany could be integrated into the system as its sort of dynamic center, but not a military threat to its neighbors. That's a lot of what lies behind NATO. Now, getting to the NATO expansion, it's kind of more of the same. You know, it's trying to extend this conception of what Europe should be like to a broader area. Eastern Europe is the traditional third world. You know, it's the earliest third world before there was, you know, back to the 15th century. It was Europe's service area, and parts of it have to be reincorporated into the dominant regions. Others have to be subordinated, and NATO expansion is sort of, you know, what's behind it. There's no military purpose to it at this point. There wasn't much ever, in my opinion, but certainly isn't now. But its political purposes remain, and in fact expand.
I'm a master's student in communication, and my name's Shane, by the way. And
Where?
In Tampa, Florida,
Mm-hmm.
University of South Florida. And now that I've gotten into my program, I've noticed that as I'm studying critical theory, they're just focusing on Marxism. We get to read a little bit of Noam Chomsky. We go on to read
Usual place.
My dad, Michael Albert, really opened my eyes to combining things and moving on. But with the possible death of tenure, do you see more institutes like this being the only way, really, for us to get any other sort of education? I keep thinking that if I do go on for my PhD and I get in there, as tenure melts away, there's no way that anyone who isn't repeating what Pentagon wants them to say or big capitalists want them to say is going to be able to stay.
Actually, I think, first of all, I think tenure probably is going to go, but not because of, you know, for other reasons. Tenure's probably going to go because of the success of the people like us in overcoming discrimination. So one of the forms of discrimination that was ended was age discrimination. Okay, so now you can't throw anybody out on the basis of age any longer. Okay, which is a good thing, but it has various effects. One effect is that inside if you look at it from inside the universities, I mean, you know, fact of the matter is a lot of this, maybe most of the smart work is done by graduate students and young faculty. And, you know, over the years, the older faculty mostly loses interest or starts doing something else, or I don't know what, and they end up on committees and, you know, that kind of thing. And a lot of departments have a lot of dead wood in them. People haven't done anything for 30 years. Well, it's not a huge problem if you know that they're going to get rid of them at age 65, okay? So then there's useful things they can do around the university and can hang on. If they're going to stay on forever, you're in trouble. You can't bring in young people to keep the place alive, you know, and to keep the sciences going and so on, especially in the, you know, things like the sciences, for example. You need a lot of young people around because that's where most of the ideas are coming from. And sometimes, so the universities are trying various things like buying off senior faculty. Almost every big university I know has some kind of program to try to induce the senior faculty to retire early. And it doesn't mean early anymore. It means like maybe late 60s or something. And you can make a lot of money that way. I mean, like students of mine have retired all over the place with huge, huge amounts of money given to them. And then they maybe take a second job somewhere else, or, you know, maybe continue doing the same thing, anything. But now this can't go on forever. You know, it's not a viable system. So sooner or later, the success in overcoming discrimination, which is a good success, is going to lead to the abolishing of tenure, which is a bad effect, because it's going to eliminate protection for people who did break out of the system. That's, you know, world's a complicated place. You can't fine-tune it. So I think it's in the cards that tenure will be eliminated. Then what happens? Well, then it's going to turn out that the amount of freedom that will exist will depend on public support. And that's the place to build it. As to where you can get alternative things, it's through. It's very hard to do it alone. You're sitting somewhere alone in the middle of, Texas or someplace, or South Florida. It's pretty hard to have the energy or the resistance or the, resources even to try to work your way through a massive propaganda system. But when you're doing it with other people, it's not that hard. That was one of the great achievements of the labor movement. The labor movement used to have workers' education, all sorts of things, and it's a way for people to get together and collectively look at the world in a different way, and I think that's going to continue. The Central America Solidarity movement, for example, which is a very big movement, that just offered modes of interaction, a lot of it, most of it through churches, in fact, which gave people a lot of knowledge and understanding. And the same is true on just about anything I know of, whether it's economics or international affairs or welfare programs or whatever. These are collective activities. If the organizations and the structures exist, people can do a lot of things. And to the extent that they're strong and active and dynamic, they'll also protect spaces within the mainstream institutions, the media and the actually independent journalists, and there are plenty of them. They very much rely on public support. Like if the public's, people are banging down the doors of the editorial office, they'll allow them more space. And then what they do helps generate the movements. It's a lot of interaction.
I was wondering if you can comment on the relationship between Western mass media and cultural imperialism in developing countries, and what role international communications laws play in that?
Yeah, it's very complicated. I just got back from South Africa a couple of weeks ago. And while I was there, I spent some time with, as much time as I could, with local activists, people who work in the townships where the poor, shanty towns where the poor people are, and so on. And there's a very live community radio program there. There's one big, Cape Town, this big community radio station, which is the station that broadcasts to the townships. Townships are, right outside the city. You get these massive areas which nobody ever sees, where people are living in conditions you can't even describe. And the cities themselves are pretty wealthy. So the community radio is poor people inside in the townships, and they're very lively and active. A lot of black people. In South Africa, they have black and what they call colored. Means India or slaves that the Dutch brought from Malaya and so on. That's called colored. So black and colored sectors who are often at each other's throats. It's not so simple. That's what the community radio is. But one of the problems they have, the guy who was sort of organized, was telling me that if you let young people, especially young blacks, run their own programs, they're pretty soon going to be following their role models. And their role models, believe it or not, are American blacks, who they think are really the peak of the world. They don't know how blacks live in the United States. What they see, blacks for them, means what they see on television. So it's Michael Jordan, and big rap artist and all that kind of stuff. So that's what they're going to do, because that's what really has prestige. And they kind of dress like that and the styles like that, and they want that music and so on, because that's their ideal, to be like an American black. Great ideal for a 18 or 20-year-old kid. But if you can consider the picture of America that they have, not too surprising. Well, that's a very dangerous kind of cultural imperialism. That's just one aspect of it, and it's very serious. It erodes popular movements and their own integrity and developing their own cultural institutions and so on. It's a big problem throughout the world. On the other hand, there's counter tendencies which are sometimes pretty surprising. Like take, say, Brazil, big country. Brazil has American soap operas and that kind of stuff, U.S., this kind of stuff, has swept a lot of the world. Like if you're in you're in a hotel somewhere around the world, which I find myself being much more than I want to, and you turn on television, you usually get some piece of American crap. Not in Brazil. And the reason is apparently Brazilian soap opera is even worse than American ones. You know? And they've swept the field. In fact, all through Latin America and parts of the, parts of Southern Europe, people are tuned into the Brazilian junk. You know, and it's apparently, like in Nicaragua during the 80s and the Sandinista years. Every news, I mean, you walk through the streets, it's an outdoor country, you know, you walk through the streets in the poor areas, and so everything's outdoors. You hear what's going on. People may be extremely poor, but they almost always have a television set. And it's almost always tuned to something like a Brazilian soap opera. And in fact, the Sandinista newspaper listed every day, still does, but the content of, this soap opera, this person's going to have, an affair with somebody and all that kind of stuff. There you have, if you want, Brazilian cultural imperialism. But it's just, it's not that like it swept everything, but it certainly had an enormous effect. And it's quite conscious. So when India a couple of years ago, what they called liberalize, like opened up the economy to take over by foreign corporations. The first thing that the U.S. corporations did when they moved in was take over the advertising industry. It was the first move. So, in fact, the whole public relations industry in India, which is substantial, was taken over by big U.S. corporations. Okay, so you go to India, it was about a year ago, and all you see is ads for American, clothes and food and all this kind of stuff, and that, it changes attitudes. I mean, it has the effect of changing attitudes. These guys know what they're doing. They have a lot of experience. The result is that Indian-made products get undercut and swept aside by often more expensive and worse U.S. products. Because these are the prestige items. Actually, in most of the world, McDonald's is considered a very fancy restaurant. When McDonald's gets into a country, people start having their wedding parties there and that sort of thing. That's no joke. Even in Europe, it's somehow the propaganda and the imagery and the associations and the association with wealth, particularly, and with glamour and so on and so forth, that has a major effect, and it's a very destructive one. I have yet to see almost no part of the world where that's not true in my experience. Some of you, I'm sure a lot of you have been around in places and can talk, but it's all over. When I was in Brazil recently, they were compelled under the liberalization to open up, these video things that you stick in a television set. What do you call them? Yeah, you want to watch a movie on whatever they are. Yeah, okay. They had to open it up to some big American, big U.S. firm. I forget what the name of the firm is, but there's someone here that, controls a lot of the U.S. market, which they were forced to allow to set up stores in Brazil and Blockbuster. Yeah. So they're now opening up down there, and everybody's afraid they're going to take over that market. They're working very hard to change tastes and attitudes. It's another reflection of the same understanding that you can regiment minds and structure attitudes and limit perspectives, and once you've done that, then everything else sort of goes along. So yeah, it's no joke.
You see it as market development in a sense, basically.
Yeah. But it's a lot more than market development. It's really structuring thoughts and attitudes. So it is partly selling goods, but partly changing the way people think or what their aspirations are. I mean, you try to change people's aspirations so that the big goal in life is to wear the same kind of sneakers that Michael Jordan does, not to run your own society, let's say.
Then why is it that in Cuba, every Thursday night, everybody tunes into the big Brazilian soap opera that's like Dallas?
Yes, but
if you're shaping thoughts and aspirations, what's going on that Cuba is wanting to shape thoughts and aspirations?
It's not Cuba wants to. I mean, they're forced to. Who's Cuba? I mean, the leadership in Cuba would be perfectly happy to let them watch propaganda films, but people won't accept it. They want to watch the Brazilian soap opera, like in Nicaragua. These things are very seductive. Exactly why it works, I don't know, but that it does work is quite clear. I mean, I remember 40 years ago, a long time ago, in early 1950s, I forget exactly. Was this when I was, no, well, I don't know when this happened, maybe around 1960, around that time. The kibbutzim in Israel, you know, these collectives in Israel, they have a meeting the tradition for many years was that Saturday night there's a meeting of the entire collective where they sort of do planning, you know, because they're collectives. They used to be, not anymore. But they used to be authentic collectives in which you do common planning about things that matter for the community, whether it's childcare or agriculture or whatever. And the meeting was always Saturday night. Sometime, you know, back whenever it was, they had to make a decision around the whole, in the big kibbutz movements, to change the Saturday night meeting to a different night. And the reason was that at 9 o'clock on Saturday evening, they played an American cop show on television, Kojak. That'll, if those of you who know this culture will know, that'll date when it happened. So, okay, they had to delay the meetings of the collectives to put them off to a different night because everybody wanted to go home and watch Kojak. You know. These are the, you know, the left radical collectives. You know. The stuff is extremely seductive, there's no doubt about it. And it's pushed for all it's worth. And it does have a certain picture the world is presented. So a lot of the world, people think Dallas is the way Americans live. You know, a friend of mine who lives in Norway told me that Norway was the last country in Europe, apparently, which still wasn't playing, you know, Dallas or one of these things. You know that?
Those Norwegians.
Right, yeah. And there was so much popular uproar about it that they had to allow it at some point. So at one point, whenever it was, they had, I think, 15 weeks of Dynasty or one of those things. You know, it was, and this guy said that's all anybody talked about for a couple of months is what's the next episode of this going to be? You know? And that is the picture that people have of what the United States is like. They want to live like that, so we'll do what those guys tell us.
How do you fight against that kind of seduction? Is it really so embedded in the culture?
It's very hard.
Is it human nature?
I mean, it's not human nature. I mean, I mean, human nature can do lots of different things, but it does require general, real resistance. I mean, you're fighting against enormously concentrated power with tremendous wealth behind it and a lot of capacity to penetrate. And people have to be able to, I mean, it's the same, look with if you're on children, it's the same thing. How do you keep them from being caught up in this stuff? It's, it goes from that to, you know, whole cultures. Like my daughter, her kids just do not watch television, period. It's a rule. And they've accepted it, you know. I mean, they see it in their friends' houses and so on, but the television set is not on in their house, period. It's one way to do it.
It seems as though, like, in a lot of...
One second.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Boys, can you be quiet for a second?
I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the filtering process in the media institutions, like exactly what obstacles
What happens?
exist
I just saw a dramatic example of it just today, in fact. Gary Webb, this guy on the San Jose Mercury News, who broke the cocaine CIA story a couple of months ago, whenever it was. You remember that whole business? The San Jose Mercury News, small, not so small, but you know, not a major newspaper in California. Gary Webb, who's an investigative reporter there, came out with a series of stories on the two things, on the CIA cocaine connection in Central America. So CIA was sending arms down to Central America to, you know, various mercenaries, and in return pay for services rendered. They were allowed to smuggle drugs. I mean, not smuggle, you know, send drugs back to the United States, and U.S. planes land at Homestead Air Force Base and that sort of thing. And that was the trading relation. That was part of the story. The other half of the story was that he tied this up with the rise of the big crack epidemic in Los Angeles. So that was a pretty dramatic story. I mean, it wasn't going to get anywhere, except that San Jose Mercury News happens to be tuned to contemporary media, and they got it over the internet, and people picked it off the internet, and then it kind of exploded into a big story, led to a lot of protest in the black community, who kind of misinterpreted it. I mean, they interpreted it as meaning the CIA was trying to spread cocaine in the black community, but that's not what the story was or what the facts are. I mean, it's kind of like a byproduct. But they were connected, in fact. Well, that expose led to a huge counterattack on the part of the major media. They really went after him with a vengeance. So it was a big attack in the New York Times and the Washington Post about this terrible story which was sullying American journalism by not living up to our high standards, you know, because he spelled somebody's name wrong or something like that. The fact of the matter is that both of these stories, he did make a connection, but which is however strong it is, but the two stories were well known but suppressed. So the the CIA drug story was broken in 1985 by Bob Parry, who was at that time a very respected mainstream journalist in Newsweek, and he and his AP associate did break the story, but the media suppressed it. In fact, he's mostly thrown out. He now doesn't work in the media any longer, which is part of the answer to your question. But that whole story was sort of suppressed. Leslie Coburn she's an investigative reporter, used to work for CBS. She kind of pursued it further and did an interesting book on it about, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. But again, it was kind of suppressed. So the media have been able to sit on the story. They couldn't sit on the story of the explosion of crack in the cities, because that's too obvious. But they did suppress the main story, the CIA drug story, and the fact that the two things were sort of correlated, that a lot of the same people were involved, and there was obviously an interaction. That was never reported. They went after Webb, big attack against him. Finally, they somehow or other, the editor of the San Jose newspaper was agreed or was compelled, or I don't know what happened. Anyway, he did publish a sort of a apology in his own newspaper saying, well, this didn't meet our standards and so on. That was immediately splashed over the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. We're vindicated. I mean, the whole issue in the mainstream was, did this guy do the story exactly right, or did he exaggerate, did it go a little beyond his data at one point and so on. It was not, have we suppressed this fact for 15 years? That was not the story, and that still is not the story. Well, today, in the newspaper, it was announced, the little item says, Gary Webb, he had a new series of stories coming out on it. He's continued to work on it, and he's got a new series of stories coming out, extending it, but they're not going to let him publish it. In fact, he was sent off to another, police reporter, taken off these, not allowed to write on this anymore. Well, that's an example right now of how it works. That's a filtering system. He got out of line. If it hadn't been publicized, nothing much would have happened. But when it did become publicized and a huge counterattack came from the powerful institutions, support for him crumbled. Now, he is supported in the black ghettos in Los Angeles, but that's not the kind of support that protects you. You got to be supported by more substantial sectors of privilege. And that's maybe an extreme example, but it's typical. Furthermore, I would imagine that most of you know all of this from your own personal experience. Just think from early childhood and schools. I mean, who's the behavior problem and who gets ahead? I mean, unless you've had a very unusual experience, you've done the same thing I did. The way you get ahead is by saying, okay, the assignment is ridiculous. The teacher's an idiot. Everything he's telling me is a lie. But I'm going to do it anyway because I want to go to college. Okay? I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time. There are people who don't do it. They say, look, teacher's an idiot. The assignment's ridiculous. He's telling us lies. I'm not going to do it. Well, they're behavior problems. Or they're, if they're poor, they're thrown out in the streets. If they're rich and they have parents who know how to manipulate the system, parents, I have to admit, I did it myself with my son. I'm not particularly proud of it. You know how to manipulate the system. You got enough prestige. You can sort of get the kid through somehow, And But this is the way, I mean, if you haven't had experiences like that, I'm very surprised. I think if you think back, almost everybody like us has had experiences like that. And that's the filtering process. If anybody here who has made it to an elite college has made it because they were willing to be passive and obedient. Maybe not inside, like you may say, okay, I'll go along because I want to get ahead, but at some level you have to. Otherwise you just don't get through. And that filtering process goes right on through the media and through graduate school and through the professions and so on. And I can tell you case after case that I've been involved in personally of graduate students and young faculty who have essentially been killed off by the system because they simply refuse to conform. Some of the stories are pretty amazing. Well, let me tell you one, because I think she won't mind anymore if I tell it. I don't like to talk about this because individuals, you know, they have their lives to lead. But there's one at MIT. I'm what's called an institute professor, which means technically I'm non-departmental, so I get to supervise a dissertation in any department. And if a student in, say, engineering or math or someone asks me to be on a committee, it's no big problem, because they don't care, you know, it's fine. On the other hand, if a student from political science asks me to be on a committee, the whole place explodes, you know. A few students have tried, but the only ones who have ever succeeded are third world women. And there's a good reason for that. For one thing, they're tough, or they wouldn't have made it to MIT. And another thing is that they have a certain amount of leeway because people don't want to be too overtly racist and sexist, you know, so you get a little space. And they're tough anyway or they wouldn't have made it. So there are several third world women who have succeeded in getting me on a PhD committee. It usually doesn't last very long, but there's one in particular who is very tough, Marcia Coleman her name was, who comes out of, you know, black urban Boston, worked her way up, very smart, worked her way up to MIT. She wanted to do a thesis some years ago on, maybe 20 years ago or so, on 15 years ago, on media coverage of the Steve Biko assassination in South Africa. Okay, and she wanted, and that, you know, it's exactly the kind of topic I work on. I'm a perfectly natural person to be on the committee. Well, you know, the department went totally berserk. I mean, first of all, because of the topic, which they couldn't stand, and secondly, because I was on it. But she insisted, you know, she sort of, very tough. She insisted on going through. I'll never forget the first. There was when you present in the political science department. It's not quite as bad now as it was then. There's a kind of routine in which the student who has a thesis topic presents the thesis topic to the department, says this is the topic I want to work on. I mean, usually nobody even shows up, you know, like maybe your mother shows up or the, you know, the supervisor of the dissertation and so on. When she presented it, there was a notice went around to the whole department saying everybody's got to come, you know, so everybody in the faculty had to come because I was going to be there and they got to make sure they outnumber me about 40 to 1 or something. And besides, she's a really dangerous type. So everybody showed up, and she announced her thesis topic, and somebody asked her, well, what's your hypothesis? You know, you have to have a hypothesis. This is a big science. So she said, well, her hypothesis is that media coverage of the Biko assassination would reflect U.S. business interests in South Africa. I mean, it was kind of like a hush fell over the people turned red, you know, I thought they were going to explode or something. But you know, finally people calmed down enough to start throwing things at her and so on. But she withstood it, and they couldn't stop her. You know, you can't just come out and say, look, you're not allowed to work on that, period. You know, you don't get by with that. Well, what happened from then on was a charade. I mean, I kept talking, she kept coming, you know, see me all the time, describe what's happening. I mean, they kept putting new conditions on, you know, crazy requirements. You have to do something, you're supposed to do something called content analysis. I don't know if any of you are in political science, but there's some total nonsense called content analysis, in which you count up all sorts of words and it doesn't tell you a thing, you know, but has a big statistical apparatus and you have a lot of numbers and wastes a lot of time and so on. So instead of sort of reading what it doesn't have anything to do with, incidentally, is content. I think that's probably why it's called a content analysis. So it's not like let's read the editorial and see what it says, you know, but let's count up the number of times that this word appears and that word appears and so on and so forth. So she was, they forced her to waste huge amounts of time on statistical apparatus and, you know, raising the requirements of proof so you couldn't meet them in quantum physics and so on and so forth. And she kept wondering, you know, we kept talking about how to do it. I kept telling her, look, just do it, you know, do whatever they tell you and get through and go live your life. And finally, she sort of worked her way through and did make it through with a thesis that had most of the important material cut out because they wouldn't allow it in. Like she had extremely interesting interviews with journalists, American white journalists from here who were covering South Africa. One really fascinating one was with the Christian Science Monitor had a woman reporter in South Africa, what was her name, Jane Goodwin or something like that, who was pulled out by the Monitor and because of her reporting. And Marcia interviewed her and her editor. It's kind of like a Rashomon story. So she interviewed the woman and the editor who pulled her out, and they gave their version of what happened. The editor's version was, well, she was getting too emotionally involved and she was becoming irresponsible and, you know, not meeting our journalistic standards and so on, so they had to pull her out. You know. Her version, she's a good reporter, and she's out of the media since. Her version was that the way you reported from South Africa was you lived in a rich suburb of, you know, Johannesburg with 6 servants and a fancy house, and you went down to you know, met the nice right people at the right bar and so on, and that's how you reported from South Africa. She started doing things which they told her she couldn't do. She wanted to go out into the country. We're supposed to stop or what?
No.
Oh.
Finish your sentence.
Okay. She decided she was going to go out into the townships, you know, where the black people live, or into the countryside, just see what it's like. People told her, you can't do that, you'll get killed, you know, they're all monsters and so on. But she went, and everything was fine, treated nicely, and she started reporting what life is really like. Well, at that point, you know, things began to blow up in South Africa. People didn't like her reporting, and there was pressure put on the newspaper, both from South Africa and from here, to have her withdrawn. And finally, they withdrew her. Okay, well, that's the story. This is part of Marcia's dissertation. She also had a very interesting interview with Anthony Lewis, New York Times reporter, who goes there for his vacations all the time. And I think his wife is South African or something. But and that was interesting. A lot of interesting. None of that stuff was allowed in the thesis. You know, and she finally accommodated and did get through. And since Mike is standing there and telling me to shut up, I won't tell you the rest of the story. But she did make it through to a fancy university and couldn't survive just because of faculty pressure in very ugly ways. She's now working in South African-oriented NGOs. You know. That's the kind of thing, that's the way filtering works. You know, a lot of cases, like him, he could have been a fancy physicist if he wanted to. You know, instead he's wasting his time on this.
So the next class is at 3:30.
Okay.
The other class is stopping. Now you can do whatever you want. If you want to break the law, or just keep working.
Okay.
We'll take a break. The next one will start at 3:30.
I've got
Yeah.
two brief questions. The one is, I first saw or heard of you, in fact, on C-SPAN, of all places, and I don't know much about the ownership and control of C-SPAN, but it just looking back on it sort of surprises me, given the things you generally say and the things you were saying that night, generally criticizing corporations and their control in American economy. And
Just out of curiosity, what time did you hear it?
It was in fact fairly late in the evening in December of
No,
a few years ago.
it's usually the run at like 2 o'clock in the morning or something. Yeah. But the fact of the matter, if we come back to the second one later, the guy, I don't exactly know the whole structure of C-SPAN, but the guy in charge is a pretty open-minded guy. I know I sort of have an open invitation every time I'm in Washington to come in there to be on their interview shows and that sort of thing. The kind of programs that you saw, C-SPAN, however it works, I'm not quite sure how it works. Maybe it's federally funded or something, but they've got a lot of time. and they're looking for fill. So if anybody uses any enterprise, you just put a little initiative out, you can often get stuff on C-SPAN. I mean, I've been on a lot, and it's mostly because the local, mostly when I give talks, it's to some local groups organizing it. And if they have enough initiative, they can get on C-SPAN. And then it gets all over the country, I start getting tons of letters from all over. It has a good effect, but it takes some initiative. I mean, I remember recently, about a year ago, I gave a talk at Martha's Vineyard. And whoever it was, some young guy who organized it, I guess he just called. Then they use their own local. They don't send any technicians. They don't send any cameramen out or anything like that. But there's everywhere there's local people who do that kind of stuff. And so they got some local people to do the technical side, and then I don't know, send off the tape, and C-SPAN ran it. In fact, reruns it over and over. Because they have to fill a lot of space, and they're not opposed. In fact, you can get just about anything on there, I think. However, I understand it's going to get cut out. With the consolidation of the media, they're cutting down on showing C-SPAN, and a lot of places are dropping it. You just can't get on, through the Murdoch network and so on. And as it gets more commercialized, I presume those channels will be cut out. But for the moment, up till now, it's one of the many resources that the left hasn't used that are available, and there are many. I mean, with all the talk about how awful the media are, there are a lot of things that people like us have not done that could be done. One of them's this, but there's a lot more.
My second question is a direct follow-up to that, and that is, if the left, or generally people who believe that they ought to control the decisions that affect their lives, are to really make that the predominant value in this country, if they're going to be successful at doing that, it seems like media is going to have to be a big part. And so, in addition to, for example, using C-SPAN, what sort of things
in the media
have to happen? And is it generally realistic to expect that these things can happen?
Look, even without changing a thing, just within present rules and regulations, there's an awful lot that can be done. So take, say, Cambridge, where I live, Mass. They, like, I guess just about every city in the country, there's a cable television station. Part of the original Communications Act, back whenever it was, 20 years ago, had a provision that said that in order to get a grant to cover some area, the cable companies had to put in public access television on cable. And a lot of communities have maybe all, have these cable television stations. I've been in them occasionally. I mean, I'm not a high-tech freak, I don't know, but even I can tell they've got good equipment. They've got plenty of equipment, plenty of technology. They reach out, not huge, but like the Cambridge one covers the Cambridge area. It's probably, I don't know, 150,000 people or so on. They're not used. I mean, half of the stuff that's on there is kind of like freak shows. People come in and they say, I want an hour, and then they do whatever their thing is, But these are things that could be used. Somerville, which is right next door to Cambridge, it's been a little better used for community programs and for bringing in other things. There's a few other places, take around the Boston area, where it's used. Ethnic communities sometimes use it, and so on. But there's a big resource, which is sitting there. You don't have to do a thing. It's sitting there. It's publicly funded. Well, privately funded, but under a requirement from the federal government. I mean, when you give away the cable channels, you're giving away public property to private corporations. And the original condition was that they do something for the community. So the thing that they did was put in these stations. But they're not being used. Well, that's one thing. I happened to be in Brazil a couple of months ago, and there they have very interesting public television. I think this may have come up in an interview that David Barsamian and I had in Z a couple of months ago. I forget. But for example, they have in Brazil, it's kind of the opposite of the United States. The slums are around the city, not in the middle of the city. I mean, they're also in the middle of the city, but the standard style of, you know, European, Latin American cities is the rich people live inside and the slums are outside. So when you go to the slums around Rio, there's, you know, millions and millions of people living in conditions that range from, you know, sort of survivable to hopeless. But there's huge numbers of people out there. About 10 years ago, I guess, one of the small NGOs in Rio of a couple of artists and television people and so on who live in town decided to try to set up a public television project out in the slums. And the idea is to, well, I mean, I went to see one, so this is after a lot of time. They went through a lot of interesting mistakes before they finally got it to work. I'll tell you if you're interested. But anyway, what finally works and what they now do is, and I went with one, is they have a truck which has a big screen on top and has whatever equipment you need inside. But it's not a huge operation. It's all inside a little truck, little pickup truck, sort of. And they go out to one of these areas. It's all set up by the local people. They go out to a square. You know, this warm countries, everybody's outside, you know, and there's these like areas where people gather or can. So they go out to a square, truck goes in the middle, screens goes up, and then they film programs that are written by, directed by, acted by people in the community, you know. So, and it's right in primetime television time. And lots of people come out. They're all sitting around, you know, some of them are sitting in bars, I mean, some of them bring their kids. It's a sort of a nice atmosphere. And even though, even not knowing Portuguese, I could sort of figure out what it's about, or people would help. I mean, the skits were about serious things. So there was one about racism, which was quite well done, kind of a little humor and some, but the point was there. Another one was about AIDS. There was something about the debt crisis. Some of it was just entertainment, you know. And people were involved and interested in watching. Right after some series of these things, a young woman, maybe 17 or so, who was one of the actresses, lead actresses, she was going around the crowd with a mic, just asking people if they had some reaction to it, you know, what do they think, and people would talk, and it would be filmed right as they were talking. So, you know, everybody else would be watching while a person sitting in a bar is commenting on what they just saw. And then a lot of interaction and so on. And it was lively and interesting and exciting. And, you know, that's being done in a poor slum on peanuts, you know. And it's quite a big thing, goes on all the time. It took a long time before they sort of figured out how to do it so that it works. And what really worked is when the people in the community are doing everything. I mean, everything from, by now they've got people, mostly young people in the community, who have learned how to do it. So they're now picking up the technical expertise. I mean, everything from the filming to the writing and to the directing and, you know, acting and so on. And it's pretty impressive. And that's being done on real shoestrings in very poor areas. I mean, there's very few places in the United States that don't have a lot more resources than that. Takes some imagination and initiative. And they had a little money behind it from some NGO, but, you know, nothing that you couldn't organize here without any trouble. You know, it's another possibility. There are lots of things that can be done.
I've read a little bit about your talks and your school that you went to. I was always curious what happens at school, and how important do you think it would be to set up a school like that again, or if it's even possible?
Yeah, I think it'd be, in fact, there are schools like that, what were called free schools. A lot of them were quite good. There's a guy now in Boston, Alan Graubard, who's been in, he was at MIT back in the he's back in Boston, yeah. Down the days when Mike was making life difficult for everyone at MIT, Alan was around, young faculty member, very smart guy. He you know, could have gone on, gotten tenure and all that sort of thing, but he dropped out and got involved in the free school movement, which was just starting off then. And they did a lot of good things. Lots of independent schools all over the place. He stayed on in the public school system. He's still an education activist. He's now back in the Boston area working on similar things. Sure, it can be done. I think it's very important. On the other hand, I should say, looking back at my own, I described my own experience But when I think back honestly of the other people who went through exactly the same experience, I don't think it had any detectable effect. So like, I don't know anybody else who was, say, a classmate of mine or who I knew who had anything like the same reaction to it. So it wasn't intended to be a radical place. It was just intended to be non-coercive and constructive and, you know, free and not, you know, non-hierarchical and so on. So it gave opportunities to do a lot of things, but exactly what effect that had on kids is hard to say. As far as I can tell, on most, virtually none.
From what I remember of your readings, you said that one of the positions of mainstream media is that the fifth point was that they're anti-communist.
The last of those filters.
Yeah, the filters, that's right, the filters. So with the Soviet Union down, what's next? And is it China?
I don't think so. I mean, actually, I should make it, you know, if you notice the title of that book, Ed Herman's name comes first. There's a reason for that. He objected strenuously. Usually when we write together, we just do it alphabetically. So, you know, C comes before H, so my name comes first. But I insisted this time that his name come first, and the reason is he did most of the work on the book. And in particular, this part is his work, not mine. You know, I mean, I agreed to it, you know, cooperated with it and so on, but it's basically his ideas. I felt that the anti-communist filter was the wrong thing. I mean, my feeling was that it was a temporary contingency, and it's too narrow. And that now becomes clear. Like a year after the book came out, the Berlin Wall fell, and you got to play some other game, not anti-communism. But in fact, that was going on right through the 80s. So by the time the Reagan administration, you know, from the early 80s, it was pretty clear that we're going to need something else as a mobilizing principle. And if you look back, when the Reagan administration came in, they came, it was like 1980, 81, the big slogan was, we're going to fight against international terrorism. That's the plague of the age, you know, not communism. Then it became, you know, crazed Arabs, later Hispanic narco traffickers. I mean, they're kind of flailing around for something. There aren't a lot of different ways of mobilizing people, you know, making them obedient and passive. There are not many ways. And one of the ways is to get them frightened. So everybody hits on it. So you always try to get the population frightened, let them huddle in fear, and I'll protect you, and then they'll do what you say. So the Russians were useful for that purposes. And you know, they're kind of frightening, rotten system, missiles, do awful things, so it's possible to frighten people. But that obviously wasn't going to be enough. And any power system is not going to want to give up the weapon of fear. So you have to frighten people of something else. So now it's Clash of Civilizations and, you know, the drug war. Actually, if you look at the campaigns during the 1980s, they were rather skillfully done. Most of them used race. Reagan won, it was either 80 or 84, I forget which one. Where do you have this welfare mother story? 84, yeah. You know, the black woman in the Cadillac coming for the welfare check and having millions of children because you pay for it, that line. He didn't say black, but everybody understood black woman, you know. So the welfare mother was, you know, it's not something you're quite afraid of, but, you know, they're stealing from you. George Bush in the next campaign, 88, it was straight racist. That was the Willie Horton story. You know, the black criminal is out there raping your daughter and that sort of thing. They played it straight, you know, just a straight racist story. And those things had effects. I mean, they did change attitudes. So, like the attack on the minuscule, actually the attack on the welfare system has been going on since early 70s. AFDC, the one that they just killed, that had declined in value by about 50% from the early 70s till 1990. So it was going on all along. But now they finally managed to kill it with a lot of public support, I have to admit, because of this story about how these welfare mothers are stealing our money, and it's even harming them, like they're getting into welfare dependency and that sort of thing. I mean, I don't have to tell you it's all a fraud, but it worked. The crime war is the same. That was very successful. That goes back to the 60s. So it's not the end of communism. You know, it's in the late 60s there was an effort started to get people frightened of crime. And fear of crime has gone up. You look at polls, the fear of crime has gone up enormously, but crime hasn't. You know. So the level of crime is more or less stable. You know, you accommodate for faked FBI statistics. There's a lot of criminologists have pointed this out in the mainstream. Crime has not really changed very much. In fact, and the United States isn't off the spectrum either. So if you look at the industrial countries, the United States is not the highest. It's toward the high end, you know, because it has more poverty and, you know, more inequality and so on. But it's not like off the spectrum or even at the top, with one exception. The sole exception is homicides with guns or suicides with guns. So killings with guns, the United States is off the, you know, kind of like off the map. But that's because of the crazed gun culture. It's not because of the level of crime. So like in some other country where, you know, people get mad at a traffic accident and they beat each other up or something, here they pull out a gun and kill each other, you know. So there's a lot of, and there's a lot of suicides with guns too, or just accidental deaths with guns. But apart from that, like in, say, rape or robbery or car theft or, you know, you run across the list, the United States is toward the high end but not off the map. And it hasn't changed a lot. But fear of crime has gone way up. And it has been a device of mobilization. People really are terrified. I mean, if you look at the expenses for personal protection against crime, you know, crazy high-tech things on your house or your car or whatever it is, it's huge, you know, absolutely enormous. Has absolutely nothing to do with crime. In fact, according to the criminological literature, the police don't even listen to those things, because about 99% of them are, you know, something went off by accident or something like that. So it's not protecting anybody, but it's getting them frightened. You know, these are all techniques of frightening people. And when you're frightened, you accept authority. That's the idea. I don't think China's going to work. It's too far away and it's not frightening enough. Besides, American corporations don't like building up China as an enemy because they make a lot of money there. Everybody talks about this terrific Chinese economy and how it's booming and so on and so forth, you know, going to be the biggest exporter in the world and so on. Just take a look at the data. The fact is that by now about 75% of Chinese exports are foreign controlled. And the last figures I saw, about 44% are totally foreign owned. That's going up very fast. 2 years ago it was, I think, 28% foreign owned. If you go back to 1980, it was about 1% foreign owned. So what that means is by now 3/4 of Chinese exports are basically foreign corporations using cheap labor under horrendous conditions. I mean, the conditions of labor in that area of China that everybody's talking about how wonderful it is are absolutely outrageous. It's mostly young women who are, you know, brought in. Most of them have to get out by the time they're, say, 25 or something. They don't want them anymore, and they go back wherever they were. They're locked into factories. You know, the factories burned down. They had last year, the official figures for China were about 18,000 dead in just industrial accidents. The conditions are indescribable. But for foreign corporations, that's good stuff, you know. And the Chinese controlled industry, their role is declining as the foreign-owned increases. Also, quite apart from that, China, probably there's tremendous unemployment in China and tremendous poverty. In fact, the number of unemployed people in China is probably higher than the population in the United States and going up. You know. So China is a tremendous boon. There is a rich sector, and it's a big country, you know, like over 1 billion people. So the sector of people who are in the consumer society is not small, which means there's substantial market too. So for U.S. corporations or any foreign corporations, China is a very valuable asset. You get extremely cheap labor under brutal conditions because it's a very brutal state. and it exports. So it basically has nothing to do with the Chinese economy. It just the inputs go in, the exports go out. A lot of money for corporations here, and it's a market, and a big one. And they're not going to let China be made an enemy, I don't think. It's my guess, at least.
I'm interested in hearing your opinion about United States involvement and now disinvolvement with UNESCO and what implications and results you think that might have.
UNESCO, specifically?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And what political statement you think the United States was trying to make, really make when they did that.
Well, UNESCO was virtually killed about 15 years ago. There's a really good book on this if you want details. It's published. It's called Hope and Folly. The editors, it's a collection of articles. Ed Herman is one, William Preston, Herbert Schiller, forget who else. I think maybe at least the three of them, maybe somebody else. It was published by University of Minnesota Press. I don't think it ever got a single review. It's a very good book. They went through the purposeful destruction of UNESCO by the United States because they really committed a crime. In the 70s, they tried to. There was an effort to construct what was called a new world information order or something. The fact is that international information systems, like what's called information, in quotes, news and all that stuff, is highly concentrated in the very rich countries. Third world countries can't get into the act at all. And this was an effort to try to open things up, to find a way to make more access for third world countries and what they call developing countries. That's the euphemism these days, they're mostly developing downwards. But let the developing countries to have some kind of share in communications, Well, the United States went berserk, and the news agencies and the media went crazy. And they started a huge campaign about how these guys are trying to stop free speech. It's these third world maniacs. They can't stand free speech, and they're trying to stifle us, and so on and so forth. It was all total lies. The lies kept being exposed, but it didn't make any difference because the exposure of the lies never made it into the media here either. They go through the details of this. It's mind-boggling when you read it. But what happened? But it was extremely effective. It ended up with a campaign here to defund UNESCO, because these guys are totalitarians who are trying to deny free speech, by trying to prevent our monopoly of the whole world. That's how they're stopping free speech. And it worked, and the United States defunded UNESCO and essentially went out of business. It had to reconstruct, and the reconstruction, the United States always hated UNESCO. And the reason is it's kind of oriented toward third world interests, and therefore it's not an instrument of power, It had to they had to undergo what they called reform. Okay, reform means do what they tell you in Washington, and it pretty much changed. Not totally, but it changed in that respect. And now it's barely functions in its original for its original purpose. The latest thing is to try to get rid of the UN altogether. To do the same thing to the whole UN. So just now, in fact, today it was announced the latest. U.S. proposal for the United States doesn't pay its dues. If you're a big guy, you do what you like. International law doesn't mean anything. The World Court doesn't mean anything. Nothing means anything because nobody can stop you. Okay, so the United States is the biggest thug on the block, so it does whatever it feels like. It hasn't paid dues for years. It's illegal. We have a treaty that says you got to pay dues, but you do what you feel like if you're strong enough. And I think it's now over $1 billion in arrears or something like that. Well, the Clinton administration just announced yesterday or so that they would pay some portion of what they legally owe, big concession, if the UN underwent reform. Okay, the reform means, get rid of everything that we don't like. And the United States has there's a massive lying about this in the press. But the fact of the matter, it's everything you read is how the Russians blocked the United Nations, and now that the Russians are gone, we can finally do things. It's a total lie. From the 1960s, the United States is way in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions, voting alone or with you know, Israel or Albania or somebody, against General Assembly resolutions, blocking every initiative on every issue you can imagine, from human rights to international law to whatever. The U.S. is way ahead, Britain second, you know, France very distant third, Russia last. And the U.S. just turned against the United Nations. And the reason is it got out of control. It got well, you know, it's not very democratic, but it got democratized, so-called. That is, other countries got in. In the early 50s, the United States the UN was very popular, but that's because it did everything the United States said. If you think about the world situation then, the U.S. had all the wealth, all the power, all the food, everything else, and the UN just went along. You know, the U.S. says something, UN does it. So it was extremely popular. A lot of, you look back at the articles written by big shot intellectuals, it was all about how isn't this marvelous instrument of world order, you know, we finally have peace and so on. By the 1950s, decolonization was beginning, and more countries were getting in, and that continued in the 60s, and that led to a non-aligned sector. You know, there's a big non-aligned sector of the third world countries that weren't part of either of the major blocs. And they just started doing things that the U.S. didn't like, so the U.S. turned against it, and by now it's almost alone. For about 20 years it's been virtually alone against the whole UN on issue after issue. So naturally the thing to do is to get rid of it, or, you know, modify it so much that it's essentially subordinated to U.S. interests the way it was back at the founding days. And that's what this new funding request, yesterday's funding request, aims to do. If you look at the papers today, you'll notice that it's not just the third world that's angry about it. Even Europe is quite annoyed at these U.S. proposals, because it's a real power play to try to turn the UN into a straight instrument of U.S. power. Here it's talked about as in terms of reform. You know, they have too much bureaucracy and they waste money and so on, all of which is true, incidentally. But it's just as true of any, you know, General Electric or, you know, any local government you look at. But it's true, there's lots of guys riding around in big cars who don't need them and, you know, got their girlfriends on the payroll and all that kind of stuff. Sure, that's all true. But not beyond the norm, you know, for big institutions like that. I'm not sure if that was the thing that you were talking about, had in mind. It was, yeah, yeah, okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the media and the Zapatistas?
About?
About the media and the EZLN, Zapatistas and Chiapas?
Well, they have used the internet very creatively and have tried very hard to build up international support and solidarity, which is very important. They wouldn't be alive if they hadn't done that. When the Zapatista revolution took place, my expectation, and I think everybody's expectation, was that the Mexican army, which is very brutal, would just go in there and murder them, which they certainly have the force to do, with U.S. support if necessary, and that'd be the last thing we'd hear of the Zapatistas. They didn't. And the reason they didn't was because they managed to build up pretty quickly, with a rather creative use of whatever media are around, like the internet. They managed to get their story out, you know, and it turned out they had plenty of support. So within Mexico, they had enormous support, and internationally, there was a lot of solidarity. And the Mexican government, and probably the United States, realized that if they go in and kill them, Mexico is going to blow up, you know. So they backed off, and they were given, you know, they're allowed to survive as long as they stay in the jungle there. Then comes a period, then the next expectation is by the time people forget about them, the Mexican government will go in and do what it wanted to do in the first place, which I suspect is what will happen. But they have been trying to maintain visibility, both in Mexico and internationally, to protect themselves from that consequence, and so far they've managed. The Mexican government is going along with completely fraudulent negotiations, which they don't expect. You know, it's just a delaying tactic. They make an agreement and they don't keep it and drag it on and so on. And they're hoping, I think, that sooner or later the world will get bored and the rest of Mexico will get bored and then they can go in and use force. But so far, that hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened precisely because of their ability to maintain international visibility. You'll notice that they keep calling conferences and they ask people to come down and they try to set up relations in Mexico. That's protection, self-protection. And it's had an effect, and it's also influenced others, so other things have developed connected to the Zapatistas. But I don't know how long it can go on. You know, it's a little artificial at this point, because the negotiations are getting nowhere. It's now pretty clear that they'll never go anywhere. Some strange things are happening. The Vatican, the bishop down there was pretty supportive, and the Vatican didn't like him, and put in another bishop who's supposed to be more reactionary. But this new bishop has somehow gotten involved, and he's now saying, you know, pretty good things. I'm sure the Vatican is angry, but now they got two bishops there who are more or less supportive, it seems. Which is, you know, it's important. I mean, that's the kind of elite protection. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit about the corporatization of higher education?
Yeah, that's, I mean, the people who are most worried about that are actually the scientists. And there's a lot of protest and concern. I see it a lot at MIT, or you read the science journals, it's full of it. Contrary to what a lot of people think, I mean, the universities, of course, research is supported from the outside, obviously. Like, universities don't sell their own products. By now they're starting to do that, but not much. So up through the big growth period after the Second World War, it was federal government funding overwhelmingly. A lot of it Pentagon, you know, some of it National Science Foundation, NASA, you know, Atomic Energy Commission, mostly sort of around the military system. And during that period, it was very free. So at MIT, which is super Pentagon university, there's just no interference from the Pentagon. You do whatever you feel like. Because they understood that there was also no secrecy. They don't want any secrecy. The reason is that they more or less understood their role. Their role is to be a funnel for passing public funds into private pockets. Okay, that's essentially the role of the Pentagon, and the universities are part of it. MIT's, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, huge parts of it. They fund research and development. And then, if anything works, you hand it over to private corporations. Like, take, say, the internet. Okay, the internet was, all the ideas came out of the military, the ARPA, the research agency in the Pentagon. It was implemented in the universities under military contracts. This includes the software, the hardware, you know, packaging, parallel processing, advanced microprocessor design. I mean, the whole business, all publicly funded. It was, as long as that was going on, it was completely free and open, military funded for a long time. Finally, the NSF took it over. They've just, a year or two ago, handed over to private corporations. Okay. They didn't see the point of it for a long time. You know, the big entrepreneurial geniuses like Bill Gates didn't see any point to the internet.